In the second part of this video series, we're looking at mature tea. Hey everyone, I'm Sigi and I love all things Pu'er. In today's second part of this brief video series, we're going to take a look at the kind of aromas, fragrances, tastes that we can expect from mature Pu'er tea. If you've missed the first part, in that one we looked at younger teas and how they develop in their first few years of adolescence, and now we've taken a bit of a leap forward and we are looking at more mature tea and its kind of characteristics, maybe thinking back to the first video and seeing what kind of matches up, what's different. Also, I highly recommend, as sort of a preliminary to this series, if you still haven't watched it, please go and watch my Pu'er tea lexicon videos, specifically the one on Shangqi or aroma and the one on aged aroma. Both will be quite relevant here to understand some of the terms, some of the ideas and concepts that I'm going to be talking about today. Without any further ado, the two teas I'm going to drink today are the 2003 Chang Hao from the nannuoshan shop. This is another one of my favorites on there. I think this is a really nice tea. This is Chang Hao is generally known as kind of the higher quality one of the Changtai brands, and it definitely shows in this tea. Nice material and very pleasant to drink. It's from 2003, so we are looking at a tea that is going to be 20 years old this year. Along with it, I have this little tea sample that I had left from an order I made with a Taiwanese tea vendor. This tea is from sometime in the early 90s. I don't know a lot about it, but it should fall well within a category of a fairly mature tea when it comes to distinguishing the different flavor and fragrance profiles. Okay. This here is the Chang Hao, so we're going to drink the younger of the two first, just like we did in the previous video. Okay. Water is already boiling. As I've mentioned in the first video, we're just going to do a very quick rinse, and then we're going to get right into it. I am using the same parameters as last time, so 5 grams for 100 milliliters in my Gaiwan. Nothing too extraordinary. One thing that is nice about older teas is that we can give them a little bit more time to steep while I talk about the kind of expectations I have here. Now, the second tea from the last video, the 2014 Iwu, was almost 10 years old. This one is already almost 20 years old, so it's a rather large jump in time. What does that do to a tea? It means that a lot of the compounds in the tea are going to break down because of the enzymes that are present. They are going to do some work. There's going to be fermentation, further oxidation, etc. And we should see a rather distinct profile from what we saw in the previous video. In the previous video, both teas had some similarities, but there were already significant changes both in the color of the tea and the kind of fragrances we found. This time, I'm expecting larger difference. I'm expecting this to be closer to like an orange-brown almost in color. Depending on how it was stored, it might already be moving into kind of red territory, but definitely darker overall. I'm also expecting like quite different fragrances. For example, I don't think this is gonna have much in the way of like a honey fragrance. I don't think this is gonna have any kind of floral or fresh fruit fragrances. If there is fruity fragrance, it's gonna be closer to something like dried or stewed fruits, something preserved, if you want to put it that way. Okay, I think we're getting ready for the first steep soon. So let's do it. Okay. Now, first thing I notice here from the color of the tea, let's look at it again. This is still solidly in the realm of like a dark amber or maybe an orange. It is further along than the Iwu that we had previously, but the storage on this one seems fairly conservative. If a tea is 20 years old, there are also examples where you can expect a much darker color, obviously depending on storage conditions. However, even with these more conservative storage conditions, I think we can still expect a significant difference when it comes to what we're going to taste and smell. So I'm just going to pour this in, and we'll kind of go from there. I'm going to let this sit for a moment. Yeah, so the kind of fresher fragrances that we had in the previous video on both teas have almost entirely dissipated. I'm not getting much of that at all anymore. We are moving closer towards fragrances that I would describe as something like maybe herbal medicine, maybe some woodiness, something resinous, something in that direction. As we notice, compared to what I was describing previously, it feels like more notes that were kind of at the top were taken off. These fresher, fruity, floral, or even honey fragrances, and we're moving more towards the kind of bottom notes, I think is what people would call it. Woodiness, kind of a darker, sweeter, more kind of molasses-like sugariness that you could expect from things like a cough syrup, maybe. That kind of thing. It is still quite sweet, but yeah, we are just not getting these kind of fresh aromas anymore. And I think it makes sense. You know, this tea is almost 20 years old. So let's see what we find in the taste. On the empty pitcher, you get kind of a final echo of a very faint honey fragrance. So it looks like this one still has a bit of life in it. Yeah. There is zero trace of any kind of greenness or that kind of young bitterness and astringency you'd get from those kind of teas here. This one already has a rather kind of smooth and round feeling to it. I think I am getting a bit of this kind of dried fruit-ish flavor. That I've noticed in teas around this age range that were stored in rather dry conditions. You do often get that. And yeah, you get kind of a, in this case at least, kind of a gentle palette of bottom notes. Something a bit darker, a bit heavier maybe. But in this particular case, it's only just beginning to develop. This tea does still hold on to some of its youth, like we said. If you smell it here as well, we still get that faint honey aroma. But it's, you don't find much of it in the taste anymore, because there is that kind of dried fruit aroma. Instead, there is a, yeah, it just got kind of darker overall. And what might have once been a rather fresh and bright tea, has now been changed. It's entirely up to personal perspective, of course, if you say that it's like lost something or not, but in my view at least, it's just becoming a different kind of tea. And I like it in its current stage. I would have been really curious to drink this when it was like 5 years old to see what it was like back then. And it would also be interesting to drink this 10 years from now when maybe that process of maturation has come closer to its final shape. The sweet aftertaste on this tea has more depth to it than the one of the previous tea, because that bit of honey that's left is mixing in with other things in the aftertaste, and it's creating a more complex expression. It's maybe this is another concept that I'm going to mention in a future Pu'er tea lexicon video, but in this tea we can already notice that it is developing layers throughout its maturation. We get the layer that was present previously when it was younger, and to this layer we add another layer of these deeper and darker flavors, and it adds to a tea's complexity and it makes it more interesting. It's also maybe worth thinking about what distinguishes the way these flavors create complexity over time by adding different layers to the kind of single layered complexity of a younger tea. I do think there is a significant difference. It kind of feels like a horizontal broadness in the younger tea, where you of course can have like a lot of different aromas, but they all belong within the one category this tea is in, this kind of young tea. And then there is another dimension of complexity, this kind of vertical complexity that is created by this tea going through different stages of becoming more and more mature and losing some of its fragrances but gaining others from the slow breakdown of the various chemicals that are in the leaf. And I think this vertical complexity is one of the things that's so alluring about aged tea in general. Mm-hmm. Very nice. So yeah, as we can sum up, this I think we could describe as kind of a semi-mature tea, where you to some extent get things from both sides, but neither are quite fully present. There already is a bit of layering to a tea like this, but as time goes on, that layering will be developed further and further. Okay, as I finish drinking this, we have another tea. This is the 90s Sheng that I got. So this one is most likely closer to 30 years. It was also stored in Taiwan, which tends, at least the Taipei area, if I remember correctly, tends to have more humid storage overall. So hopefully we'll be able to see a significant difference between both the additional time and the more humid storage conditions of this particular tea. Okay, while this is sitting there, I'm gonna finish the Chang Thai, the Chang Hao, I think Yiwu 2003. Definitely another tea I would recommend. It makes for a fun drinking experience, and if you get all of these teas, you can of course go through the exact same thing I've been going through in these two videos and see all of these different stages for yourself. And if you do, maybe leave a comment down in the comments and tell me about how your impressions of these different teas developed along the way, both as you experienced each one individually and then looking back to the next younger one and seeing the differences there. Okay. And as always, if you enjoy what I'm doing here, please, besides just commenting, leave a like, subscribe to the channel. I want to bring you all more tea videos, both more in-depth stuff and more other things as well. And that is the best way to show me that you appreciate what I'm doing here. Okay, this tea still needs a little bit to come apart. I usually tend to prepare mature tea in Yixing teapots that are a bit better at keeping heat for longer amounts of time, because in my personal view, mature tea really likes heat. So I'm giving it a bit more time, and mature tea is also more difficult to kind of oversteep, which means that there shouldn't be a problem with doing a longer steep here in the Gaiwan to kind of make up for that otherwise lack of heat. In the meantime, I'm also gonna clean my TEAWARE, of course, so it's all nice and ready to receive what is hopefully going to be a nice and mature pu'er tea that will yet again, at least hopefully, be different from what we've had so far. But just looking at this before decanting, I think we're in a good spot. Yep, we definitely are. Okay, so first things first, let's look at the color. I think we can already see a significant difference here. This is sort of orange-brown, already slightly moving into that kind of red territory. As this keeps on aging, it's going to get more and more red and dark until it eventually almost kind of looks like a Sheng Pu'er. But yeah, this, another 10-ish years, another step in development up from what we've had before. What do I expect from this tea? Given what I'm seeing here, I'm not expecting this to be like 100% in the fully, completely aged, mature category, but I could see this having already some traces of typical aged fragrances, such as, if it's sweet, it could be a date fragrance, which is also kind of in line with the dried fruit fragrances from the previous tea, but more developed and darker, sweeter, even more than previously. I could also see this having a bit of camphor aroma, which is a very common and typical thing for properly mature pu'er tea, or maybe even a bit of ginseng aroma, which is another characteristic kind of mature tea flavor, fragrance, whatever you want to call it. I don't think these will be fully present in this tea, but we might already see hints of it. Okay. I'm gonna smell the leaves before I do anything else. Okay, the lid already makes a very nice impression. Mm-hmm. So the first thing I noticed when smelling these leaves is that there is an earthiness present in this tea that wasn't there in any of the other teas I tried in these two videos. I think this is definitely something that is quite unique to either much more humidly stored tea or very mature, like much more mature tea in general. But I'm also getting a kind of dark molasses-like sweetness underneath. Some other aromas I've personally noticed, not in this particular tea, but in mature tea in general, are a either slight kind of marzipan-like aroma or a slight vanilla aroma. The latter I can explain to some extent by the kind of breakdown of substances that's caused in the stems of the tea. But where marzipan aroma might come from, I honestly have no idea. It's just something I've seen in a couple of like 90s and older teas that I've had. And here we get earthiness, dark and heavy sweetness, and that's exactly in line with what I'd expect from a tea that's around 30 years old. Let's see what it tastes like. Yeah. The taste essentially repeats the same story. We get earthiness up front, followed by this dark, heavy sweetness. I think this might go into what people would call date aroma. I think we are getting a little bit of that. It is kind of a slightly drier sweetness than a lot of others. And the earthiness in particular might be a little reminiscent. Yeah, I think I can see some traces of what might then develop into a camphor and ginseng aroma within the next few years. What is very interesting though, like this tea I think has built another layer or two on top or underneath, however you want to see it. The Chang Hao that we've had before, there is more depth, more darkness to a tea like this. But in these new flavors that are present, you can recognize traces of where they came from, the previous kind of upper layers that were built upon. Yeah, this is nice. Something I haven't mentioned much throughout these two videos is the change in mouthfeel, because that one is also a little more difficult to articulate. I think the kind of thickness you get from the pectin that's in younger tea leaves is not found in more mature tea, but there are other things that kind of round out its texture and make it more interesting. Of course, there are different stages there as well. And we might take a closer look at those at a later point. Today I'm mostly focused on smell and taste. And I think we do see some rather stark differences in that regard. There's also, of course, like more room to go. There are a bunch of teas that only really reach their peak maturity after like 40 or 50 years. Unfortunately, I haven't yet had a chance to try teas like that, but I would love to eventually and find out how much further pu'er tea can go. But that will be a story for another time. I'm just going to finish the second steep of a very pleasant tea that is much closer to maturity than any of the other teas we've had before. And I think it's really fascinating to highlight, like one of the things I mentioned in the previous video was that the Ergatze might also have some differences compared to a tea that is like completely fresh. And similarly, on the other end of the spectrum, this tea, which already shows like good signs of maturity, still has a way to go. There is more mature stuff out there. We've only taken a look at kind of a part of the entire age spectrum of pu'er tea. There's a little more to go at the start, and there is, I honestly don't exactly know how much more to go at the other end of the spectrum. But even within what we've looked at today, we already find a great variety, from the youngest tea we've had, one that is 1 or 2 years old now, to the oldest tea we've had that's around 30 years old. The transformation that tea undergoes in that time span is huge and fascinating. Let's see the second steep here. Yeah, it essentially continues along the line of the first steep. As I've pointed out in the first video, I expect these more mature teas to be a bit more consistent across steeps compared to their younger counterparts. And so far that does seem to hold true. Like, this second steep isn't much different from the first one. It essentially continues along the same axis. But yeah, that is all I have for you today. I hope this kind of 2-part video series gave you some good insight into what you can expect out of pu'er tea at different levels of maturity. I hope that this will help guide you in identifying the rough age range of a tea when you're trying it blind. And I hope we'll see each other again soon for more tea videos. Goodbye.